The hero of Rorke's Drift. 'Twas at the camp of Rorke's Drift, and at tea-time. And busily engaged in culinary operations was a private of the line. But suddenly he paused, for he heard a clattering din. When instantly 2 men on horseback drew rein beside him. "News from the front," said one, "awful news," said the other. "Of which, we are afraid, will put us to great bother. For the black Zulus are coming, and for our blood doth thirst. And the force is cut up to pieces," shouted the first. "We're dead beat," said both, "but we've got to go on." And on they rode both, looking very woebegone. Then Henry Hook put all thought of cooking out of his mind. For he was surrounded with danger on every side he did find. He was a private of the South Wales Borderers, Henry Hook. Also a brave soldier, and an hospital cook. A soldier of the Queen, who was always ready to obey. And willing to serve God by night and day. Then away to the camp he ran, with his mind all in a shiver. Shouting, "The force is cut up, sir, on the other side of the river." Which caused the officer in command with fear to quiver. When Henry Hook the news to him did deliver. Then Henry Hook saluted, and immediately retired. And with courage undaunted his soul was fired. And the cry rang out wildly, "The Zulus are coming." Then the alarm drums were instantly set a-drumming. Then, "Fall in! Fall in!" the commanders did cry. And the men mustered out, ready to do and to die. As British soldiers are always ready to do. But, alas, on this occasion their numbers were but few. They were only 80 in number, that brave British band. And brave Lieutenant Broomhead did them command. He gave orders to erect barricades without delay. "It's the only plan I can see, men, to drive 4,000 savages away." Then the mail bags and biscuit boxes were brought out. And the breastwork was made quickly without fear or doubt. And barely was it finished when someone cried in dismay. "There's the Zulus coming just about 1,200 yards away. Methinks I see the noble hero, Henry Hook." Because like a destroying angel he did look. As he stood at the hospital entrance defending the patients there. Bayoneting the Zulus, while their cries rent the air. As they strove hard the hospital to enter in. But he murdered them in scores, and thought it no sin. In one of the hospital rooms was stationed Henry Hook. And every inch a hero he did look. Standing at his loophole he watched the Zulus come. All shouting, and yelling, and at a quick run. On they came, a countless host of savages with a rush. But the gallant little band soon did their courage crush. But the cool man Henry Hook at his post began to fire. And in a short time those maddened brutes were forced to retire. Still on came the savages into the barricade. And still they were driven back, but undismayed. Again they came into the barricade, yet they were driven back. While darkness fell swift across the sun, dismal and black. Then into the hospital the savages forced their way. And in a moment they set fire to it without dismay. Then Henry Hook flew to assist the patients in the ward. And the fighting there was fearful and hard. With yell and shriek the Zulus rushed to the attack. But for the 6th time they were driven back. By the brave British band, and Henry Hook. Who was a brave soldier, surgeon, and hospital cook. And when Lord Chelmsford heard of the victory that day, he sent for Henry Hook without delay. And they took the private before the commander. And with his braces down, and without his coat, in battle array grandeur. Then Lord Chelmsford said, "Henry Hook, give me your hand. For your conduct today has been heroic and grand. And without your assistance today we've been at a loss. And for your heroic behavior you shall receive the Victoria Cross." Beautiful Crieff. Ye lovers of the picturesque, if ye wish to drown your grief, take my advice, and visit the ancient town of Crieff. The climate is bracing, and the walks lovely to see. Besides, ye can ramble over the district, and view the beautiful scenery. The town is admirably situated from the cold winter winds. And the visitors, during their stay there, great comfort finds. Because there is boating and fishing, and admission free. Therefore they can enjoy themselves right merrily. There is also golf courses, tennis greens, and good roads. Which will make the traveling easier to tourists with great loads. And which will make the bicyclists' hearts feel gay. Because they have everything there to make an enjoyable holiday. The principal river there is the Erne, rolling on its way. And which flows from Loch Erne, and joins the silvery Tay. Above Newburgh, after a course of more than 30 miles. And as the tourist views the scene with joy he smiles. The princely domain of Drummond Castle is most beautiful to be seen. Especially when the woody landscape is blown full green. And from the entrance gate to the castle an avenue extends all the way. And to view the branches of the frieze interlacing makes the heart feel gay. Drummond Castle's flowery gardens are really very grand. They cannot be surpassed in Great Britain. And in the summer-time the bee and the butterfly are there on the wing. And with the carolling of birds the gardens doth ring. And from Knock Hill on the north and west, the view from its summit is considered the best. Because the Grampians and the Ochils can be seen. While the beautiful rich fertile valley lies between. And there are many seats where the weary traveler can rest. And there is also a fountain of water, the very best. While visitors can drink of while resting there. And gaze on the magnificent scenery and inhale the pure air. Then there's Lady Mary's Walk near the Bridge of Turret. Which I hope visitors will go and see and not forget. Because nearby grows a magnificent oak most lovely to see. Which is known by the name of Ippy Callum's tree. And at each end of this walk the visitors can ascend Lagan Hill. And as they view the woods and fields with joy their hearts will thrill. And they will find seats plenteous on this elevated bower. On which they may rest and while away the hour. The Hydropathic is situated on an eminence most grand. And is one of the largest buildings in fair Scotland. And capable of accommodating 500 visitors, who often call there. To recuperate their health and breathe the fragrant air. Then there's Abercairny, which is most beautiful to view. And Her Majesty the Queen visited the grounds in 1842. And the park and the trees has the aspect of a southern scene. And the lovely appearance of it gladdened the heart of our Queen. Then there's the village of Foulis, which tourists ought to see. Because the scenery there is charming and pretty. And there's a sycamore tree there that was planted 300 years ago. And I'm sure the sight thereof will please both high and low. Therefore, in conclusion, to all lovers of the beautiful I will say. If you really wish to spend an enjoyable holiday, I would recommend Crieff for lovely scenery and pure air. Besides, the climate gives health to many visitors during their stay there. The ancient town of Leith. Ancient town of Leith, most wonderful to be seen. With your many handsome buildings, and lovely links so green. And the first buildings I may mention are the courthouse and town hall. Also Trinity House. And the sailors' home of Call. Then as for Leith Fort, it was erected in 1779, which is really grand. And which is now the artillery headquarters in bonny Scotland. And as for the docks, they are magnificent to see. They comprise 5 docks, 2 piers, 1,141 yards long respectively. And there's steamboat communication with London and the north of Scotland. And the fares are really cheap and the accommodation most grand. Then there's many public works in Leith, such as flour mills. And chemical works, where medicines are made for curing many ills. Besides, there are sugar refineries and distilleries. Also engineer works, sawmills, rope works, and breweries. Where many of the inhabitants are daily employed. And the wages they receive make their hearts feel overjoyed. In past times Leith shared the fortunes of Edinburgh. Because if withstood 9-month siege, which caused them great sorrow. They fought against the Protestants in 1559 and in 60. But they beat them back manfully and made them flee. Then there's Bailey Gibson's fish shop, most elegant to be seen. And the fish he sells there are, beautiful and clean. And for himself, he is a very good man. And to deny it there's few people can. The suburban villas of Leith are elegant and grand, with accommodation that might suit the greatest lady in the land. And the air is pure and good for the people's health. And health, I'm sure, is better by far than wealth. The links of Leith are beautiful for golfers to play, after they have finished the toils of the day. It is good for their health to play at golf there, on that very beautiful green, and breathe the pure air. The old town of Leith is situated at the junction of the river of Leith, which springs from the land of heather and heath. And no part in the empire is growing so rapidly, which the inhabitants of Leith are right glad to see. And Leith in every way is in itself independent, and has been too busy to attend to its own adornment. But I venture to say and also mention, that the authorities to the town will pay more attention. Ancient town of Leith, I must now conclude my muse. And to write in praise of thee my pen does not refuse, because the inhabitants to me have been very kind. And I'm sure more generous people would be hard to find. They are very affable in temper and void of pride. And I hope God will always for them provide. May he shower his blessings upon them by land and sea, because they have always been very kind to me. The wreck of the steamer, Stella. 'Twas in the month of March and in the year of 1899. Which will be remembered for a very long time. The wreck of the steamer, Stella, that was wrecked on the Cascais rocks, by losing her bearings in a fog, and received some terrible shocks. That Stella was bound for the Channel Islands on a holiday trip, and a number of passengers were resolved not to let the chance slip. And the hearts of the passengers felt light and gay, as that Stella steamed out of the London docks without delay. The vessel left London at 11:15, with a full passenger list and a favourable wind from heaven. And all went well until late in the afternoon, when all at once a mist arose, alas, too soon. And as the Channel Islands were approached a fog set in. Then the passengers began to be afraid and made a chattering din. And about 3:30 the fog settled down, which caused Captain Reeks and the passengers with fear to frown. And brave Captain Reeks felt rather nervous and discontent, because to him it soon became quite evident, and from his long experience he plainly did see, that the fog was increasing in great density. Still that Stella sailed on at a very rapid rate, and, oh, heaven! Rushed headlong on to her fate, and passed o'er the jagged rocks without delay. And her side was ripped open, oh! Horror and dismay! Then all the passengers felt the terrible shock, as that Stella stuck fast upon the first ledge of rock. And they rushed to the deck in wild alarm, while some of them cried, "Oh! God protect us from harm." Then men clasped wives and daughters, and friends shook hands. And unmoved Captain Reeks upon the bridge stands, and he shouted, "Get out the boats without delay." Then the sailors and officers began to work without dismay. Again Captain Reeks cried in a manly clear voice, "Let the women and children be our first choice." Then the boats were loaded in a speedy way, and with brave seamen to navigate them that felt no dismay. Then the Stella began rapidly for to settle down, and Captain Reeks gave his last order without a frown, shouting, "Men, for yourselves, you'll better look out." Which they did, needing no second bidding, without fear or doubt. Then the male passengers rushed to the boats in wild despair, while the cries of the women and children rent the air. Oh, heaven! Such a scene! 'Twas enough to make one weep, to see mothers trying to save their children that were fast asleep. Brave Captain Reeks stood on the bridge till the ship went down, with his eyes uplifted towards heaven, and on his face no frown. And some of the passengers jumped from the ship into the sea, and tried hard to save their lives right manfully. But the sufferings of the survivors are pitiful to hear. And I think all Christian people for them will drop a tear. Because the rowers of the Boada were exhausted with damp and cold. And the heroine of the wreck was Miss Greta Williams, be it told. She remained in as open boat with her fellow passengers and crew, and sang, "Oh, rest in the Lord, and he will come to our rescue." And for 14 hours they were rowing on the mighty deep. And when each man was done with his turn he fell asleep. And about 6 o'clock in the morning a man shrieked out, "There's a sailing boat coming towards us without any doubt." And before the sailing boat could get near, a steamer hove in sight, which proved to be the steamer Lynx, to their delight. And they were conveyed to Guernsey without delay. Poor souls, with their hearts in a state of joy and dismay. But alas! More than 80 persons have been lost in the briny deep. But I hope their souls are now in heaven in safe keep. A summary history of Lord Clive. About 150 years ago. History relates it happened so. A big ship sailed from the shores of Britain, bound for India across the raging main. And many of the passengers did cry and moan, as they took the last look of their old home, which they were fast leaving far behind, and which some of them would long bear in mind. Among the passengers was a youth about 17 years old, who had been a wild boy at home and very bold, and by his conduct had filled his parents' hearts with woe, because to school he often refused to go. And now that he was going so far away from home, the thought thereof made him sigh and groan, for he felt very sad and dejected were his looks, and he often wished he had spent more time at his books. And when he arrived in India he searched for work there, and got to be a clerk in a merchant's office, but for it he didn't care. The only pleasure he found was in reading books. And while doing so, sad and forlorn were his looks. One day while feeling unhappy he fired a pistol at his own head, expecting that he would kill himself dead. But the pistol wouldn't go off although he tried every plan. And he felt sorry, and resolved to become a better man. So Clive left his desk and became a soldier brave, and soon rose to be a captain and manfully did behave. For he beat the French in every battle, after all their foolish talk and prattle. Then he thought he would take a voyage home to his friends, and for his bad behavior towards them he would make some amends, for he hadn't seen them for many years. And when he thought of them he shed briny tears. And when he arrived in London, the people after him in crowds did run, and they flocked to see him every minute, because they thought him the most famous man in it. And all the greatest people in the land were proud to shake him by the hand. And they gave him a beautiful sword because he had fought so well. And of his bravery the people to each other did tell. And when his own friends saw him they to him ran. And they hardly knew him, he looked so noble a man. And his parents felt o'erjoyed when they saw him home again. And when he left his parents again for India it caused them great pain. But it was a good thing Clive returned to India again, because a wicked prince in his territory wouldn't allow the British to remain. And he resolved to drive them off his land, and marched upon them boldly with thousands of his band. But the bad prince trembled when he heard that Clive had come, because the British at the charge of the bayonet made his army run. And the bad prince was killed by one of his own band. And the British fortunately got all his land. And nearly all India now belongs to this country, which has been captured by land and by sea, by some of the greatest men that ever did live. But the greatest of them all was Robert Clive. Beautiful Comrie and its surroundings. Ye lovers of the picturesque, away, away, to beautiful Comrie and have a holiday, and bask in the sunshine and inhale the fragrant air, emanating from the woodlands and shrubberies there. The charming village of Comrie is most lovely to be seen. especially in the summer season when the trees are green. And nearby is Loch Earn and its waters sparkling clear. And as the tourist gazes thereon his spirits it will cheer. Then is Tay Fillens is a beautiful spot, I must confess. It is really a picture of rural loveliness. Because out of the quiet lake the river ripples merrily. And all round are hills beautiful in shape and nothing uncomely. The rocky knoll to the south is a most seductive place. And in the hotel their visitors will find every solace. And the flower-decked cottages are charming to see. Also handsome villas suitable for visitors of high and low degree. Then there's Tay Fillens Hill, a prehistoric fort. And visitors while there to it should resort. And to the tourist the best approach is from the west. Because in climbing the hill his strength it will test. And descending the hill as best one may. The scene makes the tourist's heart feel gay. And by the west side is reached a wooded dell. And about 200 yards from that there's St. Fillens Well. Oh, charming Comrie! I must conclude my lay. And to write in praise of thee I virtually do say. That your lovely mountains and silver birches will drive dull care away. Therefore lovers of the picturesque, away, away. To beautiful Comrie and have a holiday. And I'm sure you will return with spirits, light and gay. After viewing the sylvan beauties and hoary beeches there. Also pines, ferns, and beautiful oaks, I do declare. Beautiful North Berwick and its surroundings. North Berwick is a watering place with golfing links green. With a fine bathing beach most lovely to be seen. And there's a large number of handsome villas also. And often it's called the Scarborough of Scotland, as Portobello. The greatest attraction is Tantallon Castle, worthy of regard. About 3 miles distant to the eastward. Which in time of war received many a shock. And it's deemed impregnable and built on a perpendicular rock. The castle was built in times unknown to history. But 'tis said it belonged to the Douglas family. And the inside is a labyrinth of broken staircases. Also ruined chambers and many dismal places. Then there's the Berwick Law Hill, 612 feet high. Which no doubt is very attractive to the eye. And skirted with a wood and a public walk. Where visitors can enjoy themselves and have a social talk. The wood is really lovely and enchanting to be seen. In the spring or summer season when the trees are green. And as ye listen to the innocent birds singing merrily there. 'Twill help to elevate your spirits and drive away dull care. Then nearby Tantallon is the fishing village of Canty Bay. Where boats can be hired to the base rock, about 2 miles away. And the surrounding scenery is magnificent to see. And as the tourists view the scene it fills their hearts with glee. Then away. Then away. Pleasure seekers in bands and view Gullen with its beautiful sands which stretch along the sandy shores of Fife where the tourist can enjoy himself and be free from strife. The last Berkshire 11, the heroes of Maiwand. 'Twas at the disastrous Battle of Maiwand, in Afghanistan. Where the Berkshires were massacred to the last man. On the morning of July the 27th, in the year 1880. Which I'm sorry to relate was a pitiful sight to see. Ayub Khan's army amounted to 12,000 in all. And honestly speaking it wasn't very small. And by such a great force the Berkshires were killed to the last man. By a murderous rebel horde under the command of Ayub Khan. The British force amounted to about 2,000 strong in all. But although their numbers were but few it didn't them appall. They were commanded by General Burrows, a man of courage bold. But, alas! The British army was defeated be it told. The 66th Berkshire Regiment stood as firm as a wall. Determined to conquer or die whatever would befall. But in the face of overwhelming odds, and covered to the last. The broken and disordered sepoys were flying fast. Before the victorious Afghan soldiers, whose cheers on the air arose. But the gallant band poured in deadly volleys on their foes. And, outnumbered and surrounded, they fell in sections like ripe grain. Still the heroes held their ground, charging with might and main. The British force, alas, were shut up like sheep in a pen, owing to the bad position General Burrows had chosen for his men. But Colonel Galbraith with the Berkshires held the enemy at bay. And had the sepoys been rallied, the Afghans would not have won the day. But on the Berkshires fell the brunt of the battle. For by the Afghan artillery they fell like slaughtered cattle. Yet the wild horsemen were met with ringing volleys of musketry, which emptied many a saddle. Still the Afghans fought right manfully. And on came the white cloud like a whirlwind. But the gallant Berkshires, alas, no help could find, while their blood flowed like water on every side around. And they fell in scores, but the men rallied and held their ground. The brave Berkshires under Colonel Galbraith stood firm in the centre there, whilst the shouts of the wild Ghazis rent the air. But still the Berkshires held them at bay, at the charge of the bayonet, without dismay. Then the Ghazis, with increased numbers, made another desperate charge on that red line of British bayonets, which wasn't very large. And the wild horsemen were met again with ringing volleys of musketry, which was most inspiring and frightful to see. Then Ayoub concentrated his whole attack on the Berkshire regiment, which made them no doubt feel rather discontent. And Jacob's rifles and the grenadiers were a confused and struggling mass. Oh heaven! Such a confused scene, nothing could it surpass. But the Berkshires stood firm, replying to the fire of the musketry, while they were surrounded on all sides by masses of cavalry. Still that gallant band resolved to fight for their queen and country, their motto being death before dishonour, rather than flee. At last the gallant British soldiers made a grand stand, while most of the officers were killed fighting hand to hand. And at length the sepoys fled from the enclosure, panic-stricken and irate. Alas! Leaving behind their European comrades to their fate. The Berkshires were now reduced to little more than 100 men, who were huddled together like sheep in a pen. But they broke loose from the enclosure, and back to back poured volley after volley in the midst of the enemy, who weren't slack. And one by one they fell, still the men fought without dismay. And the regimental pet dog stuck to the heroes throughout the day. And their cartridge pouches were empty, and of shot they were bereft. And 11 men, most of them wounded, were all that were left. And they broke from the enclosure, and followed by the little dog. And with excitement it was barking savagely, and leaping like a frog. And from the field the last 11 refused to retire. And with fixed bayonets they charged on the enemy in that sea of fire. Oh, heaven! It was a fearful scene, the horrors of that day. When I think of so many innocent lives that were taken away. Alas! The British force were massacred in cold blood. And their blood ran like a little rivulet in full flood. And the Ghazis were afraid to encounter that gallant little band. At the charge of the bayonet, oh! The scene was most grand. And the noble and heroic 11 fought on without dismay, until the last man in the arms of death stiff and stark lay. The hero of Kalapore, an incident of the Indian Mutiny. The 27th Regiment has mutinied at Kalapore. That was the substance of a telegram, which caused great uproar at Satara, on the evening of the 8th of July. And when the British officers heard it, they heaved a bitter sigh. 'Twas in the year of 1857. Which will long be remembered, oh! Heaven! That the sepoys revolted, and killed their British officers and their wives. Besides, they killed their innocent children, not sparing one of their lives. There was one man there who was void of fear. He was the brave Lieutenant William Alexander Kerr. And to face the rebels boldly it was his intent. And he assured his brother officers his men were true to the government. And now that the danger was so near at hand, he was ready to put his men to the test, and them command. And march to the rescue of his countrymen at Kalapore. and try to quell the mutiny and barbarous uproar. And in half an hour he was ready to start. With 50 brave horsemen, fearless and smart. And undaunted Kerr and his horsemen rode on without dismay. And in the middle of the rainy season, which was no child's play. And after a toilsome march they reached Kalapore. To find their countrymen pressed very hard and sore. The mutineers had attacked and defeated the Kalapore light infantry. Therefore their fellow countrymen were in dire extremity. Then the sepoys established themselves in a small square fort. It was a place of strength, and there they did resort. And Kerr had no guns to batter down the gate. But nevertheless he felt undaunted, and resigned to his fate. And darkness was coming on and no time was to be lost. And he must attack the rebels whatever be the cost. Therefore he ordered his troopers to prepare to storm the fort. And at the word of command towards it they did resort. And 17 troopers advanced to the attack. And one of his men, Gumpunt Rodeo Kerr, whose courage wasn't slack. So great was his courage he couldn't be kept back. So he resolved with Lieutenant Kerr to make the attack. Then with crowbars they dashed at the doors vigorously. Whilst bullets rained around them, but harmlessly. So they battered on the doors until one gave way. Then Lieutenant Kerr and his henchmen entered without dismay. Then Kerr's men rushed in sword in hand. Oh! What a fearful onslaught, the mutineers couldn't it withstand. And Kerr's men with straw set the place on fire. And at last the rebels were forced to retire. And took refuge in another house, and barricaded it fast. And prepared to defend themselves to the last. Then Lieutenant Kerr and Rodeo Kerr plied the crowbars again. And heavy blows on the woodwork they did rain. Then the door gave way and they crawled in. And they two great heroes side by side did begin. To charge the mutineers with sword in hand, which made them grin. Whilst the clashing of swords and bayonets made a fearful din. Then hand to hand, and foot to foot, a fierce combat began. Whilst the blood of the rebels copiously ran. And a ball cut the chain of Kerr's helmet in two. And another struck his sword, but the man he slew. Then a sepoy clubbed his musket and hit Kerr on the head. But fortunately the blow didn't kill him dead. He only staggered, and was about to be bayoneted by a mutineer. But Gumpunt Kerr laid his assailant dead without fear. Kerr's little party were now reduced to 7. Yet fearless and undaunted, and with the help of heaven. He gathered his small band possessed of courage bold. Determined to make a last effort to capture the stronghold. Then he cried, "My men, we will burn them out. And suffocate them with smoke, without any doubt." So bundles of straw and hay were found without delay. And they set fire to them against the doors without dismay. Then Kerr patiently waited till the doors were consumed. And with a gallant charge, the last attack was resumed. And he dashed sword in hand into the midst of the mutineers. And he and his 7 troopers played great havoc with their sabres. So by the skillful war tactics of brave Lieutenant Kerr, he defeated the sepoy mutineers and rescued his countrymen dear. And but for Lieutenant Kerr the British would have met with a great loss. And for his great service he received the Victoria Cross. A humble heroine. 'Twas at the Siege of Madagascar, during the Peninsular War, that a Mrs. Reston for courage outshone any man there by far. She was the wife of a Scottish soldier in Madagascar port. And to attend to her husband she there did resort. 'Twas in the spring of the year 1810. That General Sir Thomas Graham occupied Madagascar with 150 men. These consisted of a detachment from the Scots Brigade. And on that occasion they weren't in the least afraid. And Captain Maclean of the 94th did the whole of them command. And the courage the men displayed was really grand. Because they held Madagascar for 54 days. Against overwhelming numbers of the French, therefore they are worthy of praise. The British were fighting on behalf of Spain. But if they fought on their behalf they didn't fight in vain. For they beat them manfully by land and sea. And from the shores of Spain they were forced to flee. Because Captain Maclean set about repairing the old fort, so as to make it comfortable for his men to resort. And there he kept his men at work day by day, filling sandbags and stuffing them in the walls without delay. There was one woman in the fort during those trying days, a Mrs. Reston, who is worthy of great praise. She acted like a ministering angel to the soldiers while there. By helping them to fill sandbags, it was her constant care. Mrs. Reston behaved as fearlessly as any soldier in the garrison. And amongst the soldiers' golden opinions she won. For her presence was everywhere amongst the men. And the service invaluable she rendered to them. Methinks I see that brave heroine carrying her child, whilst the bullets were falling around her, enough to drive her wild. And bending over it to protect it from danger. Because to war's alarms it was a stranger. And while the shells shrieked around, and their fragments did scatter, she was serving the men at the guns with wine and water. And while the shot whistled around, her courage wasn't slack. Because to the soldiers she carried sandbags on her back. A little drummer boy was told to fetch water from the well. But he was afraid because the bullets from the enemy around it fell. And the doctor cried to the boy, "Why are you standing there?" But Mrs. Reston said, "Doctor, the bairn is feared, I do declare." And she said, "Give me the pail, laddie, I'll fetch the water." Not fearing that the shot would her brains scatter. And without a moment's hesitation she took the pail. Whilst the shot whirred thick around her, yet her courage didn't fail. And to see that heroic woman the scene was most grand. Because as she drew the water a shot cut the rope in her hand. But she caught the pail with her hand dexterously. Oh! The scene was imposing and most beautiful to see. The British fought bravely, as they are always willing to do. Although their numbers were but few. So they kept up the cannonading with their artillery. And stood manfully at their guns against the enemy. And 5 times the flagstaff was shot away. And as often was it replaced without dismay. And the flag was fastened to an angle of the wall. And the British resolved to defend it whatever did befall. So the French were beaten and were glad to run. And the British for defeating them golden opinions have won. Ah, through brave Captain Maclean and his heroes bold. Likewise Mrs. Reston, whose name should be written in letters of gold. The wreck of the Indian Chief. 'Twas on the 8th of January, 1881. That a terrific gale along the English Channel ran. And spread death and disaster in its train. Whereby the Indian Chief vessel was tossed on the raging main. She was driven ashore on the Goodwin sands. And the good captain fearlessly issued high commands. "Come, my men, try and save the vessel, work with all your might." Although the poor sailors on board were in a fearful plight. They were expecting every minute her hull would give way. And they, poor souls, felt stricken with dismay. And the captain and some of the crew clung to the main masts, where they were exposed to the wind's cold blasts. A fierce gale was blowing and the sea ran mountains high. And the sailors on board heaved many a bitter sigh. And in the teeth of the storm the lifeboat was rowed bravely towards the ship in distress, which was awful to see. The ship was lifted high on the crest of a wave, while the sailors tried hard their lives to save, and implored God to save them from a watery grave. And through fear some of them began to rave. The waves were miles long in length, and the sailors had lost nearly all their strength, by striving hard their lives to save from being drowned in the briny wave. A ration of rum and a biscuit was served out to each man. And the weary night passed, and then appeared the morning dawn. And when the lifeboat hove in sight a sailor did shout, "Thank God, there's she at last without any doubt." But, with weakness and the biting cold, several of the sailors let go their hold. And, alas, fell into the yawning sea. Poor souls! And were launched into eternity. Oh, it was a most fearful plight. For the poor sailors to be in the rigging all night, while the storm fiend did laugh and roar, and the big waves lashed the ship all o'er. And as the lifeboat drew near, the poor sailors raised a faint cheer. And all the lifeboat men saw was a solitary mast, and some sailors clinging to it, while the ship was sinking fast. Charles Tate, the coxswain of the lifeboat, was a skilful boatman, and the bravery he and his crew displayed was really grand. For his men were hardy and a very heroic set, and for bravery their equals it would be hard to get. But, thank God, out of 29 11 were saved, owing to the way the lifeboat men behaved. And when they landed with the 11 wreckers at Ramsgate, the people's joy was very great. Lines in praise of Tommy Atkins. Success to Tommy Atkins, he's a very brave man, and to deny it there's few people can. And to face his foreign foes he's never afraid. Therefore he's not a beggar, as Rudyard Kipling has said. No, he's paid by our government, and is worthy of his hire. And from our shores in time of war he makes our foes retire. He doesn't need to beg, no, nothing so low. No, he considers it more honorable to face a foreign foe. No, he's not a beggar, he's a more useful man. And, as Shakespeare has said, his life's but a span. And at the cannon's mouth he seeks for reputation. He doesn't go from door to door seeking a donation. Oh, think of Tommy Atkins when from home far away, lying on the battlefield, earth's cold clay, and a stone or his knapsack pillowing his head, and his comrades lying near by him wounded and dead. And while lying there, poor fellow, he thinks of his wife at home, and his heart bleeds at the thought, and he does moan, and down his cheek flows many a silent tear, when he thinks of his friends and children dear. Kind Christians, think of him when far, far away, fighting for his queen and country without dismay. May God protect him wherever he goes, and give him strength to conquer his foes. To call a soldier a beggar is a very degrading name, and in my opinion it's a very great shame. And the man that calls him a beggar is not the soldier's friend, and no sensible soldier should on him depend. A soldier is a man that ought to be respected, and by his country shouldn't be neglected. For he fights our foreign foes, and in danger of his life, leaving behind him his relatives and his dear wife. Then hurrah for Tommy Atkins, he's the people's friend. Because when foreign foes assail us he does us defend. He is not a beggar, as Rudyard Kipling has said. No, he doesn't need to beg, he lives by his trade. And in conclusion I will say, don't forget his wife and children when he's far away, but try and help them all you can. For remember Tommy Atkins is a very useful man. The Battle of Glencoe. 'Twas in the month of October, and in the year of 1899. Which the Boers will remember for a very long time. Because by the British Army they received a crushing blow, and were driven from Smith's Hill at the Battle of Glencoe. The Boers' plan of the battle was devised with great skill, and about 7,000 men of them were camped on Smith's Hill. And at 5:30 the battle began, and the Boers behaved bravely to a man. At 20 minutes to 6 two of the British batteries opened fire, and early in the fight some of the Boers began to retire. And in half an hour the Boers' artillery had ceased to fire, and from the crest of the hill they began to retire. And General Simons with his staff was watching every detail. The brave hero whose courage in the battle didn't fail, because he ordered the King's Royal Rifles and the Dublin Fusiliers to advance in skirmishing order, which they did with 3 cheers. Then they boldly advanced in very grand style, and encouraged by their leaders all the while. And their marching in skirmishing order was beautiful to see, as they advanced boldly to attack the enemy. For over an hour the advance continued without dismay, until they had to take a breath by the way. They felt so fatigued climbing up Smith's Hill. But, nevertheless, the brave heroes did it with a will. Then they prepared to attack the enemy. And with wild battle cries they attacked them vigorously. And with one determined rush they ascended the hill. And drove the Boers from their position sore against their will. But, alas, General Simons received a mortal wound, which caused his soldiers' sorrow to be profound. But still they fought on manfully without any dread. But, alas, brave General Simons now is dead. Oh! It was a most inspiring and a magnificent sight, to see the hussars spurring their steeds with all their might, and charging the Boers with their lances of steel, which hurled them from their saddles and made them reel. The battle raged for 6 hours and more, while British cannon Smith's Hill uptore. Still the Boers fought manfully, without dismay. But in a short time they had to give way, for the Gordon Highlanders soon put an end to the fight. Oh! It was a most gorgeous and thrilling sight, to see them with their bagpipes playing, and one ringing cheer. And from Smith's Hill they soon did the Boers clear. And at the charge of the bayonet they made them fly, while their leaders cried, "Forward, my lads, do or die." And the Boers' blood copiously they did spill. And the Boers were forced to fly from Smith's Hill. And in conclusion I hope and pray, the British will be successful when from home far away. And long may the Gordons be able to conquer the foe, at home or abroad, wherever they go. The Battle of the Modder River. 'Twas at the Modder River there was a great battle, where British shells and cannons loudly did rattle. Oh! It was a long and very heroic fight. It lasted 14 hours, but the Boers were put to flight. The battle was fought in November in the year 1899. Which will cause many wives for to repine, for the loss of their husbands that were killed in Boerland, who fell fighting heroically in combat hand to hand. At Modder River the Boers were on the right side, determined to hold that position whatever did betide. They were strongly entrenched with a frontage about 8 miles long, and their strength was about 11,000 strong. Their position was semicircular, and the British had but one chance, for up the semicircle they had to advance, because they were enfiladed on both sides. Yet, not the least daunted, they marched on with quick strides. The battle opened with an artillery duel on the right, and they wrought hard at their guns with all their might. And the Grenadier Guards and Scots Guards behaved manfully in the fray, while in the midst of a shower of bullets without dismay. The river was forded by the Guards on the right. Also the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders all eager for the fight, which certainly was a most beautiful sight, to see them fording the river on the left and right. When the British infantry moved towards the river they met with a terrible fire. But, to their honor be it said, they didn't retire, while the Boer sharpshooters simply mowed them down. But they, brave heroes, held their own and didn't frown. Yes, for hours they fought on and didn't retreat an inch, resolved to fight it out, but never to flinch, while the sharpshooters upon them their fearful fire showers, while the battle raged fearfully for 14 hours. At last they lay down to escape their fearful fire. They thought it more brave to do so rather than retire. But one of the most heroic deeds of the day was a party of the Coldstream Guards who swam across the river without dismay. And as the sun was setting the fire slackened its fearful din. But the musketry was still proceeding as darkness set in. Then the British retired, and a camp was formed near the battlefield. For the Boers had had enough of it, and had to yield. The scene on the Boer side of the river was fearful to behold. It was enough to make one's blood run cold, to see the field strewn with dead bodies all around. And in a few houses dead bodies of the Boers were found. The Naval Brigade played a very noble part, because they were skilled in the gunnery art. They drove the Boers from their position and made them run, until they cried, "Heaven save us, or we are undone." It was the British superior artillery which won the day. And the courage of the gunners, who wrought without dismay. And also through brave Lord Methuen, who encouraged them in the fight. By crying, "Forward, my lads, and give it them left and right." He congratulated the force on its hard-won victory, which helped to fill the brave heroes' hearts with glee. Long may the British Army be victorious in the fight. And may heaven always guard the right. The Relief of Ladysmith. Ye sons of Great Britain, come join with me, and sing in praise of the British Army, and the Canadian troops' great bravery. Because by them and the British Ladysmith has been relieved, which will cause Cronier to feel aggrieved. 'Twas in the year of 1900, and on the 28th of February, that the British marched to Ladysmith in grand array, commanded by General Buller, Lord Roberts, and Sir George White. 3 noble heroes, be it said, that know how to fight. Lord Roberts was well informed regarding the Boer camp. And when they heard of him coming their courage it did damp. And they began to tremble and amazed with fright, when he began to bombard their entrenchments in the morning light. Oh! It was a magnificent dash they made in the morning light. Conjointly, the Canadians, Gordons, and Shropshires, a most inspiring sight. At the charge of the bayonet a brave rush was made. Then Cronier he surrendered because he was afraid. And he gave himself up as a prisoner with 4,000 men. Because they had him hemmed in like sheep in a pen. And now he is banished to St. Helena, like the great Napoleon. And in his exile no doubt he will feel woebegone. No more the fighting Cronier will lead the Boers into the field. Against the British Army, no, he has been forced to yield. Because at the charge of the bayonet he lost all his path. And was glad to surrender himself a prisoner at Ladysmith. The sufferings of the besieged garrison must have been great. Oh, merciful heaven! Hard has been their fate. The garrison were on half a pound of meat a day. But, thank God, at last they have been relieved without dismay. Alas! Sickness and death have laid many low, and filled wives and children's hearts with woe. Because their hopes of relief were often dashed to the ground. Therefore their grief must have been profound. But thanks to General Buller, Lord Roberts, and Sir George White. Long may they live and be able to fight. And may heaven always defend the right. And watch o'er them by day and night. And in conclusion I will say, the Boers will remember their defeat at Ladysmith for many a day. And Majuba Hill has been avenged to the fullest extent, which will cause them to feel rather discontent. Success to the British Army and our brave volunteers. For their conduct in the Boer War Her Majesty reveres. Bravely they helped to put the Boers to flight, along with the Canadians, which certainly was a most beautiful sight. And as for the Gordons and Shropshires they behaved bravely at the Relief of Ladysmith, which was magnificent to see. Therefore, Ladysmith has been relieved. And, thank God, the garrison no longer will feel aggrieved. Beautiful Balmoral! Ye lovers of the picturesque, away and see. Beautiful Balmoral, near by the River Dee. There ye will see the deer browsing on the heathery hills, while adown their sides run clear sparkling rills, which the traveller can drink of when he feels dry, and admire the dark River Dee near by, rolling smoothly and silently on its way, which is most lovely to see on a summer day. There the trout do sport and play during the livelong summer day. Also plenty of salmon are there to be seen, glittering like silver in the sun's sheen. And the mountains are rugged and wild to be seen. But the woodlands are beautiful when nature's face is green. There numerous rabbits do gambol all day, amongst the green shrubbery all lively and gay. There's one charming spot most magnificent to be seen. 'Tis Balmoral Castle, the Highland home of our Queen. The surrounding scenery is enchanting to see, while nearby rolls past the lovely River Dee. Therefore, ye lovers of the picturesque, away and see. Beautiful Balmoral Castle and its grand scenery. And the sight will fill your hearts with glee, as ye walk along the bonny banks o' the River Dee. The beautiful village of Penicuik. The village of Penicuik, with its neighbouring spinning mills, is most lovely to see, and the Pentland Hills. And though of a barren appearance and some parts steep, they are covered with fine pasture and sustain flocks of sheep. There, tourists while there should take a good look, by viewing the surrounding beauties of Penicuik. About 3 miles southwest is the romantic locality of Newhall, which is most fascinating and charming to see. Then about half a mile above Newhall the river Esk is seen, which sparkles like crystal in the sun's sheen. And on the Esk there's a forking ridge forming a linn, betwixt 2 birch trees, which makes a noisy din. And on a rocky protuberance close by is Mary Stuart's bower, where Scotland's ill-starred queen spent many an hour, which is composed of turf and a nice round seat, commanding a full view of the Linn. The sight is quite a treat. Then there's Habby's How, where the beauties of summer grow, which cannot be excelled in Scotland for pastoral show. 'Tis one of the most beautiful landscapes in fair Scotland, for the scenery there is most charming and grand. Then ye tourists to the village of Penicuik haste away, and there spend the lovely summer day, by climbing the heathy, barren Pentland Hills, and drink the pure water from their crystal rills. Lord Robert's triumphal entry into Pretoria. 'Twas in the year of 1900, and on the 5th of June, Lord Roberts entered Pretoria in the afternoon. His triumphal entry was magnificent to see, the British army marching behind him fearlessly, with their beautiful banners unfurled to the breeze. But the scene didn't the Boers please, and they immediately made some show of fight. But at the charge of the bayonet they were put to flight. The troops, by the people, were received with loud cheers, while many of them through joy shed joyous tears, because Lord Roberts from bondage had set them free, which made them dance and sing with glee. Lord Roberts' march into Pretoria was inspiring to see. It is reckoned one of the greatest achievements in our military history, because the Boers were watching him in front and behind, but he scattered them like chaff before the wind. Oh! It was a most beautiful and inspiring sight, to see the British bayonets glittering in the sunlight, whilst the bands played "See the Conquering Hero Comes," while the people in ecstasy towards them run. The British marched into Pretoria like the rushing tide, and the Boers around Pretoria there no longer could abide, because the British at the charge of the bayonet made them run with fear, and fly from Pretoria just like wild deer. Then Lord Roberts cried, "Pull down the Transvaal flag, and hoist the Union Jack instead of the Transvaal rag, and shout, Britannia for ever, and long live our Queen, for she is the noblest Queen the world has ever seen." Then the Union Jack was hoisted and unfurled to the breeze, which certainly did the Boers displease, when they saw the Union Jack flying o'er their capital. The sight thereof amazed them, and did them appall. And when old Kruger saw Lord Roberts he shook with fright. Then he immediately disguised himself and took to flight, leaving his poor wife in Pretoria behind. But the British troops have treated her very kind. Now let us all thank Lord Roberts for his great bravery, who has gained for the people of Pretoria their liberty, by his skillful tactics and great generalship, be it told, and the courage of his soldiers, who fought like lions bold. Lord Roberts is a brave man, be it said, who never was the least afraid to defend his queen and country when called upon, and by his valorous deeds great battles he has won. Then success to Lord Roberts and the British Army. May God protect them by land and by sea, and enable them always to conquer the Boers, and beat all foreign foes from our shores. The Relief of Mafeking. Success to Colonel Baden-Powell and his praises loudly sing, for being so brave in relieving Mafeking. with his gallant little band of 800 men. They made the Boers fly from Mafeking like sheep escaping from a pen. 'Twas in the year of 1900 and on the 18th of May. That Colonel Baden-Powell beat the Boers without dismay. And made them fly from Mafeking without delay. Which will be handed down to posterity for many a day. Colonel Baden-Powell is a very brave man. And to deny it, I venture to say, few men can. He is a noble hero, be it said. For at the siege of Mafeking he never was afraid. And during the siege Colonel Baden was cheerful and gay. While the starving population were living on brawn each day. And alas! The sufferings of the women and children were great. But they all submitted patiently to their fate. For 7 months besieged they fought the Boers without dismay. Until at last the Boers were glad to run away. Because Baden-Powell's gallant band put them to flight. By cannon shot and volleys of musketry to the left and right. Then long live Baden-Powell and his brave little band. For during the siege of Mafeking they made a bold stand. Against yelling thousands of Boers who were thirsting for their blood. But as firm as a rock against them they fearlessly stood. Oh! Think of them living on brawn extracted from horse hides. While the inhuman Boers their sufferings deride. Knowing that the women's hearts with grief were torn. As they looked on their children's faces that looked sad and forlorn. For 217 days the Boers tried to obtain Mafeking's surrender. But their strategy was futile owing to its noble defender. Colonel Baden-Powell, that hero of renown. Who, by his masterly generalship, saved the town. Methinks I see him and his gallant band. Looking terror to the foe, oh! The sight was really grand. As he cried, "Give it them, lads, let's do or die. And from Mafeking we'll soon make them fly. And we'll make them rue their rash undertaking." The day they laid siege to the town of Mafeking. Long life and prosperity to Colonel Baden-Powell. For there's very few generals can him excel. And he is now the hero of Mafeking, be it told. And his name should be engraved on medals of gold. I wish him and his gallant little band every success. For relieving the people of Mafeking while in distress. They made the Boers rue their rash undertaking. The day they laid siege to the town of Mafeking. For during the defense of Mafeking. From grief he kept the people's hearts from breaking. Because he sang to them and did recite passages from Shakespeare which did their hearts delight. The capture of Havana. 'Twas in the year 1762 that France and Spain resolved, allied together, to crush Britain. But the British army sailed from England in May. And arrived off Havana without any delay. And the British army resolved to operate on land. And the appearance of the British troops were really grand. And by the Earl of Albemarle the British troops were commanded. All eager for to fight as soon as they were landed. Arduous and trying was the work the British had to do. Yet with a hearty goodwill they to it flew. While the tropical sun on them blazed down. But the poor soldiers wrought hard and didn't frown. The bombardment was opened on the 30th of June. And from the British battleships a fierce cannonade did boom. And continued from 6 in the morning till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And with grief the French and Spaniards sullenly did gloom. And by the 26th of July the guns of Fort Morro were destroyed. And the French and Spaniards were greatly annoyed. Because the British troops entered the fort without dismay. And drove them from it at the bayonet charge without delay. But for the safety of the city the governor organized a night attack. Thinking to repulse the British and drive them back. And with 1,500 militia he did the British attack. But the British trench guards soon drove them back. Then the Spaniards were charged and driven down the hill. At the point of the bayonet sore against their will. And they rushed to their boats, the only refuge they could find. Leaving a trail of dead and wounded behind. Then Lieutenant Forbes, at the head of his men, swept round the ramparts driving all before them. And with levelled bayonets they drove them to and fro. Then the British flag was hoisted over the bastions of Morro. Then the governor of the castle fell fighting sword in hand. While rallying his men around the flagstaff the scene was grand. And the Spaniards fought hard to save their ships of war. But the British destroyed their ships and scattered them afar. And every man in the Morro fort was bayonet or shot. Which in Spanish history will never be forgot. And on the 10th of August Lord Albemarle sent a flag of truce. And summoned the governor to surrender, but he seemed to refuse. Then from the batteries the British opened a terrific fire. And the Spaniards from their guns were forced to retire. Because no longer could they the city defend. Then the firing ceased and hostilities were at an end. Then the city of Havana surrendered unconditionally. And terms were settled, and the harbor, forts, and city. With a district of 100 miles to the westward. And loads of gold and silver were the British troops' reward. And all other valuable property was brought to London. The spoils that the British army had won. And it was conveyed in grand procession to the Tower of London. And the Londoners applauded the British for the honours they had won. General Roberts in Afghanistan. 'Twas in the year of 1878, and the winter had set in. Lord Roberts and the British army their march did begin. On their way to Afghanistan to a place called Kabul. And the weather was bitter cold and the rivers swollen and full. And the enemy were posted high up amongst the hills. And when they saw the British, with fear their blood thrills. The savages were camped on the hillsides in war array. And occupying a strong position which before the British lay. And viewed from the front their position was impregnable. But Lord Roberts was a general of great skill. Therefore to surprise the enemy he thought it was right. To march upon the enemy in the dead of night. Then the men were mustered without delay. And each man of them was eager for the fray. And in the silent darkness they felt no dismay. And to attack the enemy they marched boldly away. And on they marched bravely without fear or doubt. And about daybreak the challenge of an Afghan sentinel rang out. And echoed from rock to rock on the frosty biting air. But the challenge didn't the British scare. Then the Highlanders attacked them left and right. And oh! It was a gorgeous and an inspiring sight. For a fierce hand-to-hand struggle raged for a time. While the pibrochs skirled aloud, oh! The scene was sublime. Then the Gurkhas did the Afghans fiercely attack. And at every point and turning they were driven back. And a fierce hand-to-hand struggle raged for a time. While in the morning sunshine the British bayonets did shine. And around the ridge or knoll the battle raged for 3 hours. And British bullets fell amongst them in showers. For Captain Kelso brought us his mountain battery. And sent his shells right into the camp of the enemy. Then the left of the Afghans was turned, and began to flee. Meanwhile, on the enemy's strong position Lord Roberts launched an attack. And from their position they could hardly be driven back. Because the Afghans were hid amongst the woods and hills. Still with undaunted courage, the British blood thrills. And the Afghans pressed the British hotly, but they didn't give way. For the 8th Gurkhas and the 72nd kept them at bay. And the mountain guns shells upon them did fire. Then the 8th Punjab, bounding up the heights, made them retire. Then Major White seized a rifle from one of his men and did retire. And levelled the piece fearlessly and did fire. And with a steady and well-timed shot. He shot the Afghan leader dead on the spot. Then the British with a wild cheer dashed at them. And on each side around they did them hem. And at the bayonet charge they drove them down the hill. And in hundreds they did them kill. Then in a confused mass they fled down the opposite side of the hill. In hundreds driven by sheer force sore against their will. And helter-skelter they did run. For all their positions were carried and the victory won. Then on the 8th of August again Lord Roberts' march began. For to fight the rebel Ayub Khan. and with an army about 7,000 strong. On his way to Kandahar he fearlessly marched along. And the battle that followed at Kandahar was a complete victory. And Lord Robert's march to Kandahar stands unrivaled in history. And let's thank God that sent Lord Roberts to conquer Ayub Khan. For from that time there's been no more war in Afghanistan. Success to Lord Roberts. He's a very brave man. For he conquered the Afghans in Afghanistan. With an army about 7,000 strong. He spread death and desolation all along. The Battle of Corunna. 'Twas in the year of 1808, and in the autumn of the year. Napoleon resolved to crush Spain and Portugal without fear. So with a mighty army 300,000 strong. Through the passes of the Pyrenees into Spain he passed along. But Sir John Moore concentrated his troops in the north. And into the west corner of Spain he boldly marched forth. To cut off Napoleon's communications with France. He considered it to be advisable and his only chance. And when Napoleon heard of Moore's coming, his march he did begin. Declaring that he was the only general that could oppose him. And in the month of December, when the hills were clad with snow, Napoleon's army marched over the Guadiana hills with their hearts full of woe. And with 50,000 cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Napoleon marched on, facing obstacles most dismal to see. And performed one of the most rapid marches recorded in history. Leaving the command of his army to Generals Soult and Ney. And on the 5th of January Soult made his attack. But in a very short time the French were driven back. With the Guards and the 50th Regiment and the 42d Conjoint. They were driven from the village of El Nina at the bayonet's point. Oh! It was a most gorgeous and inspiring sight. To see Sir John Moore in the thickest of the fight. And crying aloud to the 42d with all his might. Forward, my lads, and charge them with your bayonets left and right. Then the 42d charged them with might and main. And the French were repulsed again and again. And although they poured into the British ranks a withering fire, the British at the charge of the bayonet soon made them retire. Oh! That battlefield was a fearful sight to behold. 'Twas enough to make one's blood run cold. To hear the crack of the musketry and the cannon's roar. Whilst the dead and the dying lay weltering in their gore. But oh heaven! It was a heartrending sight. When Sir John Moore was shot dead in the thickest of the fight. And as the soldiers bore him from the field they looked woebegone. And the hero's last words were, "Let me see how the battle goes on." Then he breathed his last with a gurgling sound. And for the loss of the great hero the soldiers' sorrow was profound. Because he was always kind and served them well. And as they thought of him tears down their cheeks trickling fell. Oh! It was a weird and pathetic sight. As they buried him in the citadel of Corunna at the dead of night. While his staff and the men shed many tears. For the noble hero who had commanded them for many years. Success to the British Army wherever they go. For seldom they have failed to conquer the foe. Long may the Highlanders be able to make the foe reel. By giving them an inch or two of cold steel. The burning of the ship, Kent. Good people of high and low degree. I pray ye all to list to me. And I'll relate a harrowing tale of the sea. Concerning the burning of the ship, Kent, in the Bay of Biscay. Which is the most appalling tale of the present century. She carried a crew, including officers, of 148 men. And 20 lady passengers along with them. Besides 344 men of the 31st Regiment. And 20 officers with them, all seemingly content. Also the soldiers' wives, which numbered 43. And 66 children, a most beautiful sight to see. And in the year of 1825, and on the 19th of February. The ship, Kent, sailed from the Downs right speedily. While the passengers' hearts felt light with glee. And the beautiful ship proceeded on her way to Bengal. While the passengers were cheerful one and all. And the sun shone out in brilliant array. And on the evening of the 28th they entered the Bay of Biscay. But a gale from the southwest sprang up that night, which filled the passengers' hearts with fright. And it continued to increase in violence as the night wore on, whilst the lady passengers looked very woebegone. Part of the cargo in the hold consisted of shot and shell. And the vessel rolled heavily as the big billows rose and fell. Then 2 sailors descended the forehold carrying a light, to see if all below was safe and right. And they discovered a spirit cask and the contents oozing rapidly. And the man with the light stooped to examine it immediately. And in doing so he dropped the lamp while in a state of amaze. And, oh horror! In a minute the forehold was in a blaze. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when the accident took place. And, alas! Horror and fear was depicted in each face. And the sailors tried hard to extinguish the flame. But, oh heaven! All their exertions proved in vain. The inflammable matter rendered their efforts of no avail. And the brave sailors with overexertion looked very pale. And for hours in the darkness they tried to check the fire. But the flames still mounted higher and higher. But Captain Cobb resolved on a last desperate experiment. Because he saw the ship was doomed, and he felt discontent. Then he raised the alarm that the ship was on fire. Then the passengers quickly from their beds did retire. And women and children rushed to the deck in wild despair. And, paralyzed with terror, many women tore their hair. And some prayed to God for help, and wildly did screech. But, alas! Poor souls, help was not within their reach. Still the gale blew hard, and the waves ran mountains high. While men, women, and children bitterly did cry to God to save them from the merciless fire. But the flames rose higher and higher. And when the passengers had lost all hope, and in great dismay, the lookout man shouted, "Ho! A sail coming this way!" Then every heart felt light and gay. And signals of distress were hoisted without delay. Then the vessel came to their rescue, commanded by Captain Cook. And he gazed upon the burning ship with a pitiful look. She proved to be the brig, Cambria, bound for Vera Cruz. Then the captain cried, "Men, save all ye can, there's no time to lose." Then the sailors of the Cambria wrought with might and main, while the sea spray fell on them like heavy rain. First the women and children were transferred from the Kent by boats, ropes, and tackle without a single accident. But, alas! The fire had reached the powder magazine. Then followed an explosion. Oh! What a fearful scene! But the explosion was witnessed by Captain Babby of the ship Carline, who most fortunately arrived in the nick of time. And 14 additional human beings were saved from the Kent. And they thanked Captain Babby and God, who to them succor sent, and had saved them from being burnt, and drowned in the briny deep. And they felt so overjoyed that some of them did weep. And in the first port in England they landed without delay. And when their feet touched English soil their hearts felt gay. A Tale of Christmas Eve. 'Twas Christmastide in Germany. And in the year of 1850. And in the city of Berlin, which is most beautiful to the eye, a poor boy was heard calling out to passers-by. "Who'll buy my pretty figures?" loudly he did cry. Plaster of Paris figures, but no one inclined to buy. His clothes were thin and he was nearly frozen with cold, and wholly starving with hunger, a pitiful sight to behold. And the twilight was giving place to the shadows of approaching night. And those who possessed a home were seeking its warmth and light. And the market square was dark and he began to moan, when he thought of his hungry brother and sisters at home. Alas! The poor boy was afraid to go home. Oh, heaven! Hard was his lot, for money he'd none. And the tears coursed down his cheeks while loudly he did cry, "Buy my plaster of Paris figures, oh! Please come by." It was now quite dark while he stood there. And the passers-by did at the poor boy stare, as he stood shivering with cold in the market square. And with the falling snow he was almost frozen to the bone. And what would it avail him standing there alone? Therefore he must make up his mind to return home. Then he tried to hoist the board and figures onto his head. And for fear of letting the board fall he was in great dread. Then he struggled manfully forward without delay. But alas! He fell on the pavement, oh! Horror and dismay! And his beautiful figures were broken and scattered around him. And at the sight thereof his eyes grew dim. And when he regained his feet he stood speechless like one bowed down. Then the poor boy did fret and frown. Then the almost despairing boy cried aloud, and related his distress to the increasing crowd. Oh! What a pitiful sight on a Christmas Eve! But the dense crowd didn't the poor boy relieve, until a poor woodcutter chanced to come along. And he asked of the crowd what was wrong. And 20 ready tongues tells him the sad tale. And when he heard it the poor boy's fate he did bewail. And he cried, "Here! Something must be done and quickly too. Do you hear? Every blessed soul of you. Come, each one give a few pence to the poor boy. And it will help to fill his heart with joy." Then the woodcutter gave a golden coin away. So the crowd subscribed largely without delay, which made the poor boy's heart feel gay. Then the woodcutter thanked the crowd and went away. So the poor boy did a large subscription receive. And his brother, mother, and sisters had a happy Christmas Eve. And he thanked the crowd and God that to him the money sent. And bade the crowd good night, then went home content. The death of Captain Ward. 'Twas about the beginning of the past century. Billy Bowles was pressed into the British Navy, and conveyed on board the Waterwitch without delay, scarce getting time to bid farewell to the villagers of Fairway. And once on board the Waterwitch he resolved to do his duty, and if he returned safe home he'd marry Nellie Blythe, his beauty. And he'd fight for old England like a jolly British tar. And the thought of Nellie Blythe would solace him during the war. Poor fellow, he little thought what he had to go through. But in all his trials at sea he never did rue. No, the brave tar became reconciled to his fate, and felt proud of his commander, Captain Ward the Great. And on board the Waterwitch was Tom Riggles, his old comrade. And with such a comrade he seldom felt afraid, because the stories they told each other made the time pass quickly away, and made their hearts feel light and gay. 'Twas on a Sunday morning and clear to the view. Captain Ward the attention of his men he drew. "Look," he cried, "there's 2 French men of war are right. Therefore prepare, my lads, immediately to begin the fight." Then the Waterwitch was steered to the ship that was most near, while every man resolved to sell their lives most dear. But the French commander disinclined to engage in the fight, and he ordered his men to put on a press of canvas and take to flight. Then Captain Ward gave the order to fire. Then Billy Bowles cried, "Now we'll get fighting to our heart's desire." And for an hour a running fight was maintained, and the 2 ships of the enemy near upon the Waterwitch gained. Captain Ward walked the deck with a firm tread, when a shot from the enemy pierced the ship, yet he felt no dread. But with a splinter Bill Bowles was wounded on the left arm, and he cried, "Death to the frog-eaters, they have done me little harm." Then Captain Ward cried, "Fear not, my men, we will win the day. Now, men, pour in a broadside without delay." Then they sailed around the St. Denis and the Gloire, and in their cabin windows they poured a deadly fire. The effect on the 2 ships was tremendous to behold. But the Frenchmen stuck to their guns with courage bold, and the crash and din of artillery was deafening to the ear, and the cries of the wounded men were pitiful to hear. Then Captain Ward to his men did say, "We must board the Frenchmen without delay." Then he seized his cutlass as he spoke, and jumped on board the St. Denis in the midst of the smoke. Then Bill Bowles and Tom Riggles hastily followed him. Then, hand to hand, the battle did begin. And the men sprang upon their foe and beat them back, and hauled down their colours and hoisted the Union Jack. But the men on board the St. Denis fought desperately hard. And just as the St. Denis was captured, a ball struck Captain Ward right on the forehead, and he fell without a groan. And for the death of Captain Ward the men did moan. Then the first lieutenant, who was standing near by, loudly to the men did cry, "Come, men, and carry your noble commander below. But there's one consolation, we have beaten the foe." And thus fell Captain Ward in the prime of life. But I hope he is now in the better world, free from strife. But, alas! 'Tis sad to think he was buried in the mighty deep, where too many of our brave seamen silently sleep. The death of the Queen. Alas! Our noble and generous Queen Victoria is dead. And I hope her soul to heaven has fled, to sing and rejoice with saints above, where is joy, peace, and love. 'Twas on January 22nd, 1901, in the evening she died at 6:30 o'clock. Which to the civilized world has been a great shock. She was surrounded by her children and grandchildren dear. And for the motherly, pious Queen they shed many a tear. She has been a model and faithful Queen. Very few like her have been. She has acted virtuously during her long reign. And I'm afraid the world will never see her like again. And during her reign she was beloved by the high and the low. And through her decease the people's hearts are full of woe, because she was kind to her subjects at home and abroad. And now she's receiving her reward from the eternal God. And during her reign in this world of trouble and strife, several attempts were made to take her life. Maclean he tried to shoot her, but he did fail. But he was arrested and sent to an asylum, which made him bewail. Victoria was a noble queen, the people must confess. She was most charitable to them while in distress. And in her disposition she wasn't proud nor vain. And tears for her loss will fall as plentiful as rain. The people around Balmoral will shed many tears, owing to her visits amongst them for many years. She was very kind to the old, infirm women there, by giving them provisions and occasionally a prayer. And while at Balmoral she found work for men unemployed, which made the hearts of the poor men feel overjoyed. And for her Majesty they would have laid down their lives, because sometimes she saved them from starving, and their wives. Many happy days she spent at Balmoral, viewing the blooming heather and the bonny Highland floral, along with Prince Albert, her husband dear. But alas! When he died she shed many a tear. She was very charitable, as everybody knows. But the loss of her husband caused her many woes, because he cheered her at Balmoral as they the heather trod. But I hope she has met him now at the throne of God. They ascended the hill of Morven when she was in her 40th year. And her Majesty was delighted as she viewed the Highland deer. Also dark Lochnagar, which is most beautiful to see, not far from Balmoral, and the dark River Dee. I hope they are walking in heaven together as they did in life, in the beautiful celestial regions, free from all strife, where God's family together continually meet, where the streets are paved with gold, and everything complete. Alas! For the loss of Queen Victoria the people will mourn, but she unto them can never return. Therefore to mourn for her is all in vain, knowing that she can never return again. Therefore, good people, one and all, let us be prepared for death when God does on us call. Like the good and noble Queen Victoria of renown, the greatest and most virtuous queen that ever wore a crown. The Siege of Seringapatam. 'Twas on the evening of the April 5th, 1799. Which will be remembered for a very long time. The ever-memorable Siege of Seringapatam, where the British resolved to fight to a man. The British army was commanded by General Harris, which seemed very grand. And Sir David Baird was second in command. And prominent amongst the officers was Sir Arthur Wellesley, who at the siege behaved very heroically. The British army was about 20,000 strong. And fearlessly through Indian territory they marched along. Determined to conquer Tipu Sahib they were bent. Or to die, rather than surrender, in the attempt. Tipu Sahib was a savage despot, a devotee to the Mohammedan faith, and had tortured many of the English and put them to death. But thanks be to God, that did send the British to crush and bring him to an untimely end. Then the trenches were opened without delay. And each man was eager to join in the fray, and drive the enemy from two strong points where they lay. So they made a stealthy dash upon them without dismay. But the enemy were on the lookout and burned red light, which lighted up the heavens and made a very weird sight. And by the light the British were revealed. But British hearts with courage against them were steeled. Then the enemy assailed the British without dismay. And the British ranks were thrown into disarray, owing to the showers of rockets which moved them down. But Major Shaw ordered the men to lay themselves on the ground. Then the sepoy army closely upon the British did draw. But up and at them, 12, shouted the gallant Major Shaw. Then up sprang the soldiers, and Major Shaw rushed at the enemy. And the enemy cried, "The English are upon us," and did flee. Then Colonel Wellesley and his men onward did press. And on the following day orders were given to storm the fortress. And the hour for the assault was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. While from the fort occasionally the cannons did boom. And after 3 days cannonade a breach was made in the walls. And the sight thereof the hearts of the enemy appalls. Because the Highlanders were leaping from rock to rock. And the foot of the breach was gained shortly after 1 o'clock. Then the gallant Sergeant Graham planted the British flag on the walls. And loudly unto his men he calls, "Come, men! Let's give 3 cheers without dread." But the words had barely escaped his lips when he fell dead, owing to a musket ball that passed through his head. Then the defenders from the fort began to retreat, because the Highlanders at the bayonet charge drove them into the street. Oh! The sight was inspiring and grand. While Tipu Sahib little thought his doom was near at hand. But when he heard that the breach had been carried, no longer in his beautiful palace he tarried. And at the head of his men he rushed into the field. But in a short time he was forced to yield. Tipu Sahib's army was more than 100,000 strong. But although the British were less in number their courage it was strong. And the British made a bold charge and made them retreat. And Tipu Sahib and his rebel army were fairly beat. Then with a handful of followers Tipu Sahib took to flight, and spurred his horse to the palace with all his might. But the British overtook him and shot him dead. Therefore the tyrant was conquered, and his followers fled. So thus fell Tipu Sahib, a very cruel man. And his great fortress of Seringapatam. And the spoil that fell into the British hands was great. Money, jewels, and arms, likewise costly silver plate. The downfall of Delhi. 'Twas in the year of 1857 and on the 14th of September. That the sepoy rebels at Delhi were forced to surrender. The attack was first to be made by Brigadier Nicholson. And he was ordered to attack the Kashmir bastion. The British were entirely in command of Major General Reid, assisted by Brigadier Generals Wilson and Burnand. After a long march, fighting through a hostile country. And the brave heroes took up a position before the city. Delhi gates were encircled with a fringe of fire. But the British resolved to die rather than retire. And the brave fellows rushed towards the gate, carrying the powder bags that were to seal the sepoys' fate. Here their progress was checked, for the drawbridge was destroyed. But the British felt very little annoyed, because a few planks were across the chasm thrown. Then a match was applied to the powder bags, and into atoms the gate was blown. Then the rebel artillerymen with terror fled. For the streets were strewn by the sepoy dead. Then the British charged them without fear, shouting, "On boys, on, for our queen and country dear." Then Lieutenant Home gave orders to advance, and charge them with your bayonets, it is our only chance. And with a ringing British cheer they charged them fearlessly. And they drove the enemy before them through the streets of the city. Then the young bugler blew a blast loud and clear, which was answered by a British ringing cheer. But General Nicholson was killed, which was a great loss. And afterwards the bugler was decorated with the Victoria Cross. General Jones formed a junction with Colonel Campbell's regiment. And to enter by the Kashmir Gate they were bent. And they advanced through the streets without delay, and swept all before them through the gate without dismay. The streets were filled with mutineers who fought savagely, determined to fight to the last and die heroically. While the alarm drums did beat, and the cannons did roar, and the dead and the dying lay weltering in their gore. And the rebels fought for King Timur like tigers in a cage. He was a very old man, more than 90 years of age. And their shouts and yells were fearful to hear, while the shrill sound of the bugle smote on the ear. The British dash at Delhi will never be forgot, for the chief instigators of the mutiny were shot, and their bodies in the mayor's court were hung. And as the people gazed thereon, their hearts with anguish were wrung. And that evening General Wilson drank the health of the Queen. Also his officers hailed her Empress of India, which enhanced the scene. While the assembled thousands shouted, "God save the Queen." Oh! It was a most beautiful scene. Delhi was a glorious prize, for the city was full of jewels and gold, besides 100 pieces of cannon, be it told. But dearly was the victory gained. But in the book of fame the British are famed. Oh, it was a glorious and heroic victory, and will be handed down to posterity. An all-night sea fight. Ye sons of Mars, come list to me, and I will relate to ye a great and heroic naval fight, which will fill your hearts with delight. The fight was between the French frigate Pique and the British frigate Blanche. But the British crew were bold and staunch, and the battle was fought in West Indian waters in the year of 1795. And for to gain the victory the French did nobly strive. And on the morning of the 4th of January while cruising off Guadeloupe, the lookout man from the foretop loudly spoke, and cried, "Sail ahoy! Where away?" "On the lee bow, close in shore, sir," was answered without delay. Then Captain Faulkner cried, "Clear the decks." And the French vessel with his eyeglass he inspects. And he told his men to hoist the British flag, and prepare my heroes to pull down that French rag. Then the Blanche made sail and bore away in the direction of the Pique without delay. And Captain Faulkner cried, "Now, my lads, bear down on him, and make ready quickly and begin." It was about midnight when the Frenchmen hove in sight, and could be seen distinctly in the starlight. And for an hour and a half they fired away, broadsides into each other without dismay. And with the rapid flashes the heavens were aflame, as each volley from the roaring cannons came. And the incessant roll of musketry was awful to hear, as it broke over the silent sea and smote upon the ear. The French vessel had nearly 400 men. Her decks were literally crowded from stem to stern. And the musketeers kept up a fierce fire on the Blanche. But still the Blanche on them did advance. And the Blanche's crew without dismay fired a broadside into the Pique without delay, which raked her fore and aft, and knocked her to smash. And the mizzen mast fell overboard with a terrible crash. Then the Frenchmen rushed forward to board the Blanche. But in doing so they had a very poor chance. For the British tars in courage didn't lack, because thrice in succession on their own deck they were driven back. Then, brave, my lads. Captain Faulkner loudly cries. Lash her bowsprit to our capstan, she's our prize. And he seized some ropes to lash round his foe. But a musket ball pierced his heart and laid him low. Then a yell of rage burst from the noble crew. And near to his fallen body they drew. And tears for his loss fell fast on the deck. Their grief was so great their tears they couldn't check. The crew was very sorry for their captain's downfall. But the sight didn't their brave hearts appall. Because they fastened the ropes to the peak at the capstan. And the peak was dragged after the Blanche, the sight was grand. Yet the crew of the peak maintained the fight. Oh! Most courageously they fought in the dead of night. And for 2 hours they kept up firing without dismay. But it was a sacrifice of human life, they had to give way. And about 5 o'clock in the morning the French cried for quarter. Because on board there had been a great slaughter. Their captain Conseil was mortally wounded in the fight. Along with many officers and men, oh! It was a heartrending sight. To see the wounded and dead weltering in their gore. After the cannonading had ceased and the fighting was o'er. The Battle of Gujrat. 'Twas in the year of 1849, and on the 20th of February. Lord Gough met and attacked Sher Singh right manfully. The Sikh army numbered 40,000 in strength. And showing a front about 2 miles length. It was a glorious morning, the sun was shining in a cloudless sky. And the larks were singing merrily in the heavens high. And 'twas about 9 o'clock in the morning the battle was begun. But at the end of 3 hours the Sikhs were forced to run. Lord Gough's force was a mixture of European and native infantry. And well supported with artillery and cavalry. But the British army in numbers weren't so strong. Yet, fearlessly and steadily, they marched along. Sher Singh, the king, had taken up a position near the town. And as he gazed upon the British army he did frown. But Lord Gough ordered the troops to commence the battle. With 60 big guns that loudly did rattle. The Sikhs were posted on courses of deep water. But the British in a short time soon did them scatter. Whilst the British cannonading loudly hums. And in the distance were heard the enemy's drums. The Sikhs began to fight with their artillery. But their firing didn't work very effectively. Then the British lines advanced on them right steadily. Which was a most inspiring sight to see. Then the order was given to move forward to attack. And again, through fear the enemy drew back. Then Penny's brigade, with a ringing cheer, advanced briskly. And charged with their bayonets very heroically. Then the Sikhs caught the bayonets with their left hand. And rushed in with their swords, the scene was heroic and grand. Whilst they slashed and cut with great dexterity. But the British charge was irresistible, they had to flee. And with 150 men they cleared the village of every living thing. And with British cheers the village did ring. And the villagers in amazement and terror fled. Because the streets and their houses were strewn with their dead. The chief attack was made on the enemy's right. By Colin Campbell's brigade, a most magnificent sight. Though they were exposed to a very galling fire. But at last the Sikhs were forced to retire. And in their flight everything was left behind. And the poor Sikhs were of all comfort bereft. Because their swords, cannon, drums, and wagons were left behind. Therefore little pleasure could they find. Then Sher Singh fled in great dismay. But Lord Gough pursued him without delay. And captured him a few miles away. And now the Sikhs are our best soldiers of the present day. Because India is annexed to the British dominions, and they must obey. The Ashanti War, the fall of Kumasi. 'Twas in the year of 1874, and on New Year's Day. The British army landed at Elmina without dismay. And numbering in all, 1,400 bayonets strong. And all along the Cape coast they fearlessly marched along. Under the command of Sir Garnet Wolseley, a hero bold. And an honour to his king and country, be it told. And between them and Kumasi, lay a wilderness of jungle. But they marched on boldly without making a stumble. And under a tropical sun, upwards of 100 miles. While their bayonets shone bright as they marched on in files. Kumasi had to be reached and King Coffee's power destroyed. And, before that was done, the British were greatly annoyed. Lieutenant Lord Gifford, with his men, gained the crest of the Adenesi hills. And when they gained the top, with joy their hearts fills. Sir John MacLeod was appointed general of the Black Brigade. And a great slaughter of the enemy they made. And took possession of an Ashanti village. And fought like lions in a fearful rage. While the British troops most firmly stood. And advanced against a savage horde concealed in a wood. Yet the men never flinched, but entered the wood fearlessly. And all at once the silence was broken by a roar of musketry. And now the fight began in real earnest. And the Black Watch men resolved to do their best. While the enemy were ambushed in the midst of the wood. Yet the Highlanders their ground firmly stood. And the roar of the musketry spread through the jungle. Still the men crept on without making a stumble. And many of the Black Watch fell wounded and dead. And Major Macpherson was wounded, but he rallied his men without dread. The battle raged for 5 hours, but the Highlanders were gaining ground. Until the bagpipes struck up their wild clarion sound. Then the dusky warriors fled in amazement profound. Because their comrades were falling on every side around. Sir Archibald Allison led on the Highland Brigade. And great havoc amongst the enemy they made. And village after village they captured and destroyed. Until King Coffee lost heart and felt greatly annoyed. Sir John MacLeod took the command of his own regiment. And with a swinging pace into the jaws of death they went. Fearlessly firing by companies in rotation. Dashed into a double zone of fire without hesitation. And in that manner the Black Watch pressed onward. And the enemy were powerless their progress to retard. Because their glittering bayonets were brought into play. And panic-stricken the savage warriors fled in great dismay. Then Sir Garnet Wolseley with his men entered Kumasi at night. Supported by half the rifles and Highlanders, a most beautiful sight. And King Coffee and his army had fled. And thousands of his men on the field were left dead. And King Coffee, he was crushed at last. And the poor king felt very downcast. And his sorrow was really profound. When he heard that Kumasi was burned to the ground. Then the British embarked for England without delay. And with joy their hearts felt gay. And by the end of March they reached England. And the reception they received was very grand. McGonagall's Ode to the King. Oh God, I thank thee for restoring King Edward VII's health again. And let all his subjects throughout the empire say Amen. May God guard him by night and day. At home and abroad, when he's far away. May angels guard his bed at night when he lies down. And may his subjects revere him, and on him do not frown. May he be honored by them at home and abroad. And may he always be protected by the eternal God. My blessing on his noble form, and on his lofty head. May all good angels guard him while living and when dead. And when the final hour shall come to summons him away. May his soul be wafted to the realms of bliss, I do pray. Long may he reign, happy and serene. Also his queen most beautiful to be seen. And may God guard his family by night and day. That they may tread in the paths of virtue and not go astray. May God prosper King Edward VII wherever he goes. May he always reign victorious over his foes. Long may he be spared to wear the British crown. And may God be as a hedge around him at night when he lies down. May God inspire him with wisdom, and long may he reign. As Emperor of India and King Edward VII. Amen. The coronation of King Edward VII. 'Twas in the year of 1902, and on August the 9th, a beautiful day. that thousands of people came from far away, all in a state of excitement and consternation, resolved to see King Edward VII's coronation. Westminster Abbey doors were opened at 7 o'clock. Then the people and invited guests began to flock. And one of the first to arrive was Mr. Seton, resplendent in his Privy Councillor's uniform, which did his body magnificently adorn. There were judges in white wigs sat in the front row, accompanied by their wives, which made a grand show. And the Maharajas, with dazzling robes, were grand to behold, glittering with diamonds and silver and cloth of gold. When the seats were all occupied, I must confess, the scene was dazzling to see. The ladies in full dress, glittering with jewels and pearls and golden brocade. The scene was fascinating, and on the guests a deep impression made. It was some time before the procession began to arrive, and each one in the crowd hard did strive, and craned their necks with great anxiety, all anxious to see King Edward VII in pomp and pageantry. The coronation ceremony was really very grand. There were countesses present, and duchesses from many a foreign land, all dressed in costly dresses, glittering with diamonds and gold. Oh, the scene was most beautiful to behold. And, from without the abbey, cheering was distinctly heard, which showed that the people for the king had great regard. For with one voice they cried, "God save the king." Then the band struck up the national anthem, which made the streets ring. Then the standard-bearers lowered their flags as the king did arrive. Then the crowd of people there forcibly did strive to see their noble king, as he passed along. But few people saw him, the crowd was so throng. After the standard-bearers came 4 knights of the Garter right jauntily, and conspicuous among whom were Lord Rosebery, and Lord Spencer, the tall Red Earl looking very airy, and Mr. Balfour followed as Lord Privy Seal, and walking side by side with the Duke of Devonshire, in whom he could confide. The Queen, from first to last, was the crowning glory of the ceremony. Her beauty, her grace, her exquisite dress was lovely to see. And her train of crimson and gold was borne by 8 gentlemen, which certainly was a great honor conferred upon them. And the Duchess of Buccleuch brought up the rear without delay, which was the most lovely picture witnessed in the abbey that day. And as she entered, the choir boys cried, "Long live the Queen." The scene was so fascinating and thrilling to be seen. King Edward throughout the ceremony seemed quite content. And when the Archbishop administered the oath of good government, the king's response was, "I am willing," must have been heard down the nave. So said the king without fear. His courage was brave. And as the Archbishop approached to put the crown on his head, a silence fell on the great congregation, as of the dead, because they saw the Archbishop seemed pale and shaky with dread, and felt unable to put the crown on the king's head. But the king saw what was wrong, but he didn't frown. And with the aid of his own hands he put on the crown. And oh, what a majestic appearance, but he didn't flinch. And in his royal robes of state he looked the king every inch. Then the heir apparent and the princes passed his majesty. That incident was the most touching of the ceremony. Then the king took the prince by the hand and pressed it warmly, and kissed him lovingly on cheek and brow, which was beautiful to see. When Queen Alexandra was being crowned she looked lovely and gay. And the ceremony took only a few minutes' delay. And the king permitted the Archbishop to retire to his chair. Likewise the primate felt very weak, he was well aware. Then came the Queen, wearing her crown, and carrying a scepter in one hand, and an ivory rod in the other, which looked very grand. Then walks towards the king, and bowed herself reverently. Then the king returns the salutation with respectful dignity. Then the king and queen walked to the altar in silence profound. Then the harmony of the choir and organ began to sound. Then the king and queen removed their crowns and knelt side by side. Then the archbishop prayed to God to be their guide. Then at the close of that solemn rite they both put on their crowns, and take their scepters in their hands, while neither of them frowns. Then robed in purple and velvet, they prepare to take their departure. The queen goes first, and the king follows after. Then the king entered his beautiful coach, the sides were made of glass, especially made so that his subjects might see him pass. And he seated himself by his queen, most lovely and gay. Then the royal coach was driven by 8 beautiful bays away. And the people cried, "Long live King Edward and his beautiful queen," declaring such a sight they had never seen, and which they would remember for many a day, because they had seen their king and queen on coronation day. Beautiful Torquay! All ye lovers of the picturesque, away to beautiful Torquay and spend a holiday. 'Tis health for invalids for to go there, to view the beautiful scenery and inhale the fragrant air, especially in the winter and springtime of the year, when the weather is not too hot, but is balmy and clear. Torquay lies in a very deep and well-sheltered spot, and at first sight by strangers it won't be forgot. 'Tis said to be the mildest place in England, and surrounded by lofty hills most beautiful and grand. 'Twas here that William of Orange first touched English ground, and as he viewed the beautiful spot his heart with joy did rebound. And an obelisk marks the spot where he did stand, and which for long will be remembered throughout England. Torquay, with its pier and its diadem of white, is a most beautiful and very dazzling sight, with its white villas glittering on the sides of its green hills. And as the tourist gazes thereon with joy his heart fills. The heights around Torquay are most beautiful to be seen, especially when the trees and shrubberies are green. And to see the pretty houses under the cliff is a treat. And the little town enclosed where 2 deep valleys meet. There is also a fine bathing establishment near the pier, where the tourist can bathe without any fear. And as the tourists there together doth stroll, I advise them to visit a deep chasm called Daddy's Hole. Then there's Babblicombe, only 2 miles from Torquay, which will make the stranger's heart feel gay, as he stands on the cliff 400 feet above the sea. Looking down, 'tis sure to fill his heart with ecstasy. The lodging houses at Babblicombe are magnificent to be seen, and the accommodation there would suit either king or queen. And there's some exquisite cottages embowered in the woodland, and sloping down to the sea shore, is really very grand. You do not wonder at Napoleon's exclamation, as he stood on the deck of the Bellerophon, in a fit of admiration, when the vessel was lying to windbound. He exclaimed, "Oh, what a beautiful country!" His joy was profound. And as the tourist there in search of beautiful spots doth rove, let them not forget to inquire for Anstey's Cove. And there they will see a beautiful beach of milky white, and the sight will fill their hearts with delight. Oh, beautiful Torquay, with your lovely scenery, and your magnificent cottages sloping down to the sea. You are the most charming spot in all England, with your picturesque bay and villas most grand. And, in conclusion, to tourists I will say, off to Torquay and make no delay. For the scenery is magnificent, and salubrious the air, and 'tis good for the health to reside there. Drogheda and its surroundings. The town of Drogheda is situated on the River Boyne, a few miles from the sea, and is its headquarters for the exploration of its scenery. And portions of its ancient walls and 2 gate towers remain, and one of them is quite perfect, Street Lawrence by name. The west gate is in a good state of preservation, and is well worth the tourist's observation, because it will stir in him great admiration, and raise his spirits to a great elevation. The ruined church of St. Mary the First must mention, the tower of which is very fine and worthy of attention. A structure dating from the 14th century, and deserves special notice, because it is wonderful to see. Then there's King William's Glen and the Boyne Valley to be seen. The spot where King William's troops charged across the stream. And an imposing obelisk is there, which marks the spot where the Battle of the Boyne was fought, which will never be forgot. And as the tourist for beautiful spots there doth range, I advise him to view the chambered tumulus of New Grange. And there he will see remarkable caves, wonderful to be seen. And in the summer-time the entrance is beautiful with shrubberies green. The monastery of Mellifont is most wonderful to see, and will repay the tourist who visits the locality. For within the enclosure is a tower standing 110 feet high, which arrests the attention of strangers while passing by. Then there's the celebrated Hill of Slain, which is a very great height and of historical fame, because on Easter Eve St. Patrick lighted the Paschal fire, and worshipped God there to his heart's desire. Then the tourist should visit the castle of Dunmow, and the scene there will drive from him all woe, and spend a day or two in visiting Tara and Bective Abbey. For around there is some great curiosities to see. Then there's Loch Earn, most beautiful to be seen, and dotted with beautifully wooded isles, charming and green, and freely thrown open for public inspection, for the visitor's amusement, and to which the proprietor has no objection. There the tourist will find comfortable accommodation, and nothing short of pleasant recreation. For there's boating and fishing if the tourist wishes, which will be excellent sport while catching the big and little fishes. Then ye lovers of beautiful scenery away, away to Drogheda, in Ireland, and have a holiday, and view the romantic scenery and inhale pure air, emanating from the sea and wild flowers and woodlands there. The Battle of Inkermann. 'Twas in the year of 1854, and on the November 5th, which Britain will no doubt long remember, when the Russians plotted to drive the British army into the sea. But at the bayonet charge the British soon made them flee. With 1,400 British, 15,000 Russians were driven back. At 7:30 in the morning they made the attack. But the Grenadiers and Scottish Fusilier Guards, 700 strong, moved rapidly and fearlessly all along, and their rifles were leveled ready for a volley. But the damp had silenced their fire, which made the men feel melancholy. But the Russians were hurled down the ravine in a disordered mass. At the charge of the bayonet, an inspiring sight, nothing could it surpass. General Cathcart thought he could strike a blow at an unbroken Russian line. Oh! The scene was really very sublime, because hand to hand they fought with a free will, and with one magnificent charge they hurled the Russians down the hill. But while General Cathcart, without any dread, was collecting his scattered forces, he fell dead, pierced to the heart with a Russian ball, and his men lamented sorely his downfall. While the Duke of Cambridge, with the colours of 2 regiments of guards, presses forward, and no obstacle his courage retards, and with him about 100 men. And to keep up their courage he was singing a hymn to them. Then hand to hand they fought the Russians heroically, which was a most inspiring sight to see. Captain Burnaby with 13 guardsmen fighting manfully, and they drove the Russians down the hillside right speedily. The French and Zouaves aided the British in the fight, and they shot down and killed the Russians left and right. And the chasseurs also joined in the fight, and the Russians fell back in great affright. Then the Russians tried again and again to drive the British from the slopes of Inkermann, but all in vain. For the French and British beat them back without dismay, until at last the Russians had to give way. And the French and British fought side by side, until the Russians no longer the bayonet charge could abide. And the Russians were literally scorched by the musketry fire. And in a short time the Russians were forced to retire. Then the British and the French pursued them into the depths of the ravine. Oh! It was a grand sight, the scene was really sublime. And at 1:30 the Russians were defeated. And from the field of Inkermann they sullenly retreated. Then the Battle of Inkermann was won. And from the field the Russians were forced to run. But the loss of the British was terrible to behold. The dead lay in heaps stiff and cold, while thousands of Russians were dying with no one to aid them. Alas! Pitiful to relate, thousands of innocent men. The Battle of Toulouse. 'Twas in the year of 1814, and on April the 10th day, that Wellington with the British army came in grand array, prepared to attack the city of Toulouse without dismay. And his heavy guns he planted there without delay. Wellington called in his divisions and brought up 9,000 Spaniards strong, and followed the retreating French, harassing them all along. And the position held by Soult was ridges 2 miles in length, and fortified by redoubts and of very great strength. General Soult led on the French without dismay, but the British and Spanish armies soon made them give way. For Picton and Allen with the Portuguese advanced to the canal, and smote the French with ringing volleys of musketry which did them appall. The British and Spanish armies advanced in grand array, in a kind of semicircle, and they made a beautiful display. As they marched on boldly and a heroic charge they made, for they swept the French before them in the face of a heavy cannonade. Oh! It was a fearful and melancholy sight, to see innocent men shooting each other with all their might, while heavy cannon balls the earth uptore, and the dead and the dying lay weltering in their gore. The French kept shouting, "Vive l'Empereur," as their battle cry. But the British sent a shower of rockets which made them fly, and terror-stricken they retreated without delay to their positions on the heights in great dismay. Then Lambert's division dashed fearlessly up the slope, but the French against his division couldn't cope, and musketry fire blazed from rank to rank, and General Taupin fell dead. And Lambert's brigade drove the French from the heights without any dread. Then the French cavalry charged, but all in vain. But Lambert's brigade repulsed them again and again. And the French were fighting on 3 sides of a square, while their derisive shouts did rend the air. And the French on every side were falling back. But General Soult rallied his men for a last attack. Then the 42nd and 79th Highlanders joined in the fight, and at the charge of the bayonet they scattered them left and right. Then the Spaniards were rallied and they made a fresh attack. And at every point in turning, the French were driven back. And to continue the fight longer Soult thought it no use, and he abandoned the heights and fell back into the city of Toulouse. And on that night he evacuated the city without delay, and retired with the main body of his army in disordered array, leaving behind 4 generals and 16,000 men, as prisoners confined there like sheep in a pen. Thus ended the long war, and the French were disbanded. And the British soldiers were sent home again and all safely landed. And mothers, sisters, and brothers were glad to see them again, while many of them couldn't from tears refrain. The city of Sligo, and its adjacent surroundings. Beautiful city of Sligo, most charming to be seen, with your lovely Glencoe lake and shrubberies green, situated in the center of a richly wooded plain, where the tourist can enjoy himself while he does there remain. While on one side is Loch Gill, which is very grand, which is equal to any lake in Ireland. And row boats can be had for exploring the lake at Sligo. And the tourists' hearts will feel gay while on it they do row. Then there's the seat of the Honourable John A. Wynne, which is famous for its timber being so very fine. The domain is certainly very lovely and grand, and is one of the finest estates in Ireland. The ruins of Sligo Abbey are behind the Imperial Hotel, and the principal building is the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Then there's Glencoe, where there's a waterfall 300 feet in height, and as the tourist gazes thereon it will his heart delight. The visitors are told in Sligo the water runs uphill, and when told so with wonder their hearts does fill. The fact is when the wind blows south the water doesn't fall, And strange thoughts to the minds of the tourists it does recall. Then the tourist can go by steamer or car 5 miles away, from Sligo to Ross's Point, and spend the day. At golf, there's a good golf course there. And there the tourist can enjoy himself free from care. The golf course there is most beautiful to be seen. And most suitable for the game, it's so level and green. Whilst the pure air will strengthen them while at play, and help to drive from their heart's dull care away. Then there's Bundoran, a most charming spot, which once seen by tourists will never be forgot. There the tourist, if he wishes, can have excellent sport. And there tourists from foreign lands often resort. The scenery there is magnificent to be seen, when the trees and fields wear their livery of green, and the blackbird and thrush there doth sing, making the woodlands with their musical notes to ring. Then there's splendid fishing can be had on Loughs Melvin and Macnean. And the trouts caught there are most beautiful to be seen. And a few miles from Bundoran is the best fishing centre in Ireland. And the scenery there is enchanting and grand. Then, ye sons of toil, away, away, to Sligo in Ireland, and have a holiday. And climb the green hills and ramble through forests fair. It will strengthen your bodies and drive away dull care. Montrose. Beautiful town of Montrose, I will now commence my lay. And I will write in praise of thee without dismay. And in spite of all your foes, I will venture to call thee bonny Montrose. Your beautiful chain bridge is magnificent to be seen, spanning the river Esk, a beautiful tidal stream, which abounds with trout and salmon, which can be had for the catching without any gammon. Then as for the mid-links, it is most beautiful to be seen, and I'm sure is a very nice bowling green, where young men can enjoy themselves and inhale the pure air, emanating from the sea and the beautiful flowers there. And as for the High Street, it's most beautiful to see. There's no street can surpass it in the town of Dundee, because it is so long and wide, that the people can pass on either side, without jostling one another or going to any bother. Beautiful town of Montrose, near by the seaside, with your fine shops and streets so wide. 'Tis health for the people that in you reside, because they do inhale the pure fragrant air, emanating from the pure salt wave and shrubberies growing there. And the inhabitants of Montrose ought to feel gay, because it is one of the bonniest towns in Scotland at the present day. The Battle of Culloden, a historical poem. 'Twas in the year of 1746, and in April the 14th day, that Prince Charles Stuart and his army marched on without delay. And on the 14th of April they encamped on Culloden Moor. But the army felt hungry, and no food could they procure. And the calls of hunger could not brook delay. So they resolved to have food, come what may. They, poor men, were hungry and in sore distress. And many of them, as well as officers, slipped off to Inverness. The prince gave orders to bring provisions to the field, because he knew without food his men would soon yield to the pangs of hunger, besides make them feel discontent. So some of them began to search the neighborhood for refreshment. And others, from exhaustion, lay down on the ground. And soon in the arms of Morpheus they were sleeping sound, while the prince and some of his officers began to search for food, and got some bread and whiskey, which they thought very good. The Highland army was drawn up in 3 lines in grand array, all eager for the fray in April the 16th day, consisting of the Athole brigade, who made a grand display on the field of Culloden on that ever memorable day. Likewise the Camerons, Stuarts, and Macintoshes, McLaughlins and McLeans, and John Roy Stuart's regiment, united into one, these are their names. Besides the MacLeods, Chisholms, MacDonalds of Clanranald and Glengarry. Also the noble chieftain Keppoch, all eager the English to harry. The second line of the Highland army formed in column on the right, consisting of the Gordons, under Lord Lewis Gordon, ready for the fight. Besides the French Royal Scots, the Irish Piquets or Brigade. Also Lord Kilmamock's Foot Guards, and a grand show they made. Lord John Drummond's regiment and Glenbucket's were flanked on the right by Fitzjames's Dragoons and Lord Elcho's Horse Guards, a magnificent sight. And on the left by the Perth Squadron under Lord Strathallan. A fine body of men, and resolved to fight to a man. And there was Pitsligo, and the Prince's bodyguards under Lord Balmerino. And the third line was commanded by General Stapleton, a noble hero. Besides, Lord Ogilvy was in command of the third line or reserve, consisting of the Duke of Perth's regiment and Lord Ogilvy's, men of firm nerve. The prince took his station on a very small eminence, surrounded by a troop of Fitzjames's horse for his defence, where he had a complete view of the whole field of battle, where he could see the front line and hear the cannons rattle. Both armies were about the distance of a mile from each other, all ready to commence the fight, brother against brother, each expecting that the other would advance, to break a sword in combat, or shiver a lance. To encourage his men the Duke of Cumberland rode along the line, addressing himself hurriedly to every regiment, which was really sublime, telling his men to use their bayonets, and allow the Highlanders to mingle with them, and look terror to the rebel foe, and have courage, my men. Then Colonel Belford of the Duke's army opened fire from the front line. After the Highlanders had been firing for a short time, the Duke ordered Colonel Belford to continue the cannonade, to induce the Highlanders to advance, because they seemed afraid. And with a cannonball the prince's horse was shot above the knee, so that Charles had to change him for another immediately. And one of his servants who led the horse was killed on the spot, which by Prince Charles Stuart was never forgot. 'Tis said in history, before the battle began, the Macdonalds claimed the right as their due of leading the van. And because they wouldn't be allowed, with anger their hearts did burn. Because Bruce conferred that honour upon the Macdonalds at the Battle of Bannockburn, and galled beyond endurance by the fire of the English that day, which caused the Highlanders to cry aloud to be led forward without delay. Until at last the brave Clan Mackintosh rushed forward without dismay, while with grape shot from a side battery hundreds were swept away. Then the Athole Highlanders and the Camerons rushed in sword in hand, and broke through Barrow's and Monro's regiments, a sight most grand. After breaking through these two regiments they gave up the contest, until at last they had to retreat after doing their best. Then, stung to the quick, the brave Keppoch, who was abandoned by his clan, boldly advanced with his drawn sword in hand, the brave man. But, alas! He was wounded by a musket shot, which he manfully bore. And in the fight he received another shot, and fell to rise no more. Nothing could be more disastrous to the prince that day, owing to the Macdonalds refusing to join in the deadly fray. Because if they had all shown their wonted courage that day, the proud Duke of Cumberland's army would have been forced to run away. And, owing to the misconduct of the Macdonalds, the Highlanders had to yield. And General O'Sullivan laid hold of Charles's horse, and led him off the field, as the whole army was now in full retreat. And with the deepest concern the prince lamented his sore defeat. Prince Charles Stuart, of fame and renown, you might have worn Scotland's crown, if the Macdonalds and Glengarry at Culloden had proved true. But, being too ambitious for honour, that they didn't do, which, I am sorry to say, proved most disastrous to you, looking to the trials and struggles you passed through. The Battle of Sheriffmuir, a historical poem. 'Twas in the year 1715, and on the 10th of November, which the people of Scotland have cause to remember. On that day the Earl of Mar left Perth bound for Sheriffmuir, at the same time leaving behind a garrison under Colonel Balfour, besides leaving a force of about 3,000 men quartered in different parts of Fife, to protect the people's property, and quell party strife. The army along with him amounted to 3,000 foot and 1,200 cavalry, all in the best of order, a most pleasant sight to see. The two armies bivouacked near Sheriffmuir during the night. And around their campfires they talked concerning the coming fight. The Duke of Argyll's English army numbered 8,000 strong. Besides 400 horse, posted in the rear all along. And the centre of the first line was composed of 10 battalions of foot, consisting of about 4,000, under the command of Clanranald and Glengarry to boot. And at the head of these battalions Sir John Maclean and Brigadier Ogilvy. And the two brothers of Sir Donald MacDonald of Sleat, all in high glee. The Marquis of Huntly's squadron of horse was also there. Likewise the Stirling squadron, carrying the Chevalier's standard, I do declare. And the Perthshire squadron formed the left wing. And with their boisterous shouts they made the welkin ring. The centre of the second line consisted of 8 battalions of infantry. And 3 of the Earl of Seaforth's foot, famous for their bravery. There were also 2 battalions of the Marquis of Huntly. Besides the Earl of Panmure's battalion, all men of high degree. And those of the Marquis of Tullibardine, commanded by the Viscount of Strathallan. And of Logie Almond, and likewise Robertson of Strohan. Besides 2 squadrons of horse under the Earl Marischal. And the Angus squadron was on the left, these include them all. During this formation, the Duke of Argyll was watching all the time. But owing to the ground occupied by them he couldn't see their line, which was unfortunately obstructed by the brow of a hill. At the thought thereof the Duke's heart with fear did fill. The hill was occupied by a party of Earl Mar's troops looking towards Dunblane, which the Earl of Mar no doubt resolved to maintain. Then the Duke returned to the army, and ordered the drums to beat. But an hour elapsed before his army were ready Mars to meet. As soon as the Earl of Mar perceived Argyll's line was partially formed, he gave orders that Argyll's army should be instantly stormed. Then Mar placed himself at the head of the clans, and led forward his men. As a noble hero would do, which no one can condemn. Then he pulled off his hat, which he waved in his right hand. And when he arrived within pistol shot the Highlanders made a bold stand. And they poured in a volley upon the English infantry. And to the dismay of the Highlanders the English returned fire instantly. And to the horror of the Highlanders Alan Wittertack was wounded mortally. Then he was carried off the field, a most pitiful sight to see. And as his men clustered around him they stood aghast. And before he died he told them to hold their posts fast, while lamenting the death of the captain of Clanranald most pitifully. Glengarry at this juncture sprang forward right manfully. And throwing his bonnet into the air, he cried, heroically, "Revenge! Revenge! Revenge today! And morning tomorrow ye shall see." No sooner had he pronounced these words than the Highlanders rushed forward, sword in hand, upon the royal battalions with the utmost fury, which they could not withstand. And with their broadswords among the enemy they spread death and dismay, until the 3 battalions of Argyll's left wing instantly gave way. Then a complete rout ensued, and the Earl of Mar pursued them half a mile. Then he ordered his men to halt and rest a while, until he should put them into order right speedily. Then follow the enemy at the double march and complete the victory. Then the Highlanders chased them and poured in a volley. Besides they hewed them down with their broadswords mercilessly. But somehow both armies got mixed together, and a general rout ensued, while the Highlanders eagerly the English army hotly pursued. The success on either side is doubtful to this day. And all that can be said is, both armies ran away. And on whichsoever side success lay it was toward the government. And to allay all doubts about which party won, we must feel content.